It was a creed written into the founding documents that declared the destiny of a nation. Yes, we can. It was whispered by slaves and abolitionists as they blazed the trail toward freedom. Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
It was sung
by immigrants as they struck out the distant shores, pioneers who pushed westward against.
Greta, your first climate strike was a lonely event a little over a year ago, and in the intervening time you have sparked the interest of millions, literally, of children around the globe, demanding action for climate change. What's your message to world leaders today?
My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice. They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist. So a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us, we who have to live with the consequences. To have a 67% chance of staying below a 1.5 degrees of global temperature rise, the best odds given by the IPCC, the world had 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit back on January 1st, 2018. Today that figure is already down to less than 350 gigatons. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions? With today's emissions levels, that remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone within less than 8.5 years. There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today, because these numbers are too uncomfortable and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us, but the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now, is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming whether you like it or not. Thank you.
On September 24th, 2019, from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network, Greta Thunberg goes to the UN. We decided on that particular title. The title could have been the UN Climate Change Summit 2019, or perhaps the climate strike continues. Many words swirl around this activity, but we remember that this young lady from Sweden, Greta, started this movement by literally protesting outside of the Swedish parliament by herself. And later she was able to have some of her chums help her out in this particular endeavor, and this went on for a whole year. And then it became a situation that empowered people all over the globe, young people. And it culminated in the climate strike. She called hers a climate strike there in Sweden, but this was a worldwide climate strike that attracted millions of people. And hundreds of thousands of people in New York and all across the U.S., from New York to Los Angeles to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to New Orleans, Louisiana, up to Bismarck, North Dakota, Helena, Montana, and points in between along the eastern coast, from Boston on down to the Carolinas, etc. It attracted political leaders. The head of the UN said basically that you would be included in this climate summit, and they were there, and we came in with Greta's impassioned plea to world leaders and what world leaders have done. Inaction. We do have the Paris Climate Accord, but the U.S. is not part of that, and at best that is a statement of what would happen in 2050. But at the rate that the climate is changing, if you look at the various polar ends, whether it be the South or the North Pole, the glaciers are melting. And as the glaciers melt, then we have rising sea levels. That there are literally whole nations and cities of millions of people that will no longer be there. They will literally be part of the sea. In other words, they will have to move on. That is what's happening. So you're getting people displaced in the millions, and at the same time you have loss of crops, and that is even in the U.S. If you go into the Midwest area, Illinois, the Dakotas, the upper Midwest, Minnesota, etc., Wisconsin, the farmers could not get into the fields. They were late, as they say, to the game. And this is not by chance. You have extreme heat in places. In the summer we had extreme heat, and now that we are officially in autumn, in parts of the country, temps are still, and these are parts normally not, in the Midwest and in New England, etc. Temperatures are in the 70s. And also we had the polar or the Arctic vex in the winter, when the trains literally was too cold for the L's to run in Chicago. So that was part of what is happening now. Very severe winters, droughts in the west. In fact, the major provider of electricity in California and in Nevada and the Sierra area there, they have shut off the power lines. Well, why did they do that? They shut the power lines off because the last time around a town called Paradise was totally destroyed. And people were literally burned alive. And that was because of their power lines, and this very brittle force around it sparked those kinds of situations until the temperatures abated. So this is part of the urgency that's coming to move to solar power and to move to wind power. We already have wind. We have wind farms in places like the Dakotas, in Iowa. If you're down in Iowa, you'll see the wind farms all on the plains. You'll see the solar panels in California, in Arizona, in New Mexico, the western states, but you'll also see them in New York and New Jersey. And for that matter, in Boston. And in Texas. President Carter has a solar panel farm there that basically takes care of Plains, Georgia. They're on solar there. So solar is getting to be much more popular. So these are some of the reasons this movement is rising up to change these things. Even though DJ Trump said he would not go to the climate conference, showed up begrudgingly. He was not a happy person, and of course Greta Thunberg saw him, and she was not very happy. She just stared at him, and he stared back. He was red as his tie. So all he needed was a blue suit and a white shirt, and he would have been red, white, and blue. I don't know what he had on that day. I think he did have a blue suit on. But nonetheless, that is where the climate politics is, and when we conclude here, you'll hear an edited version of the testimony of the climate defenders before a select committee in the Congress. Greta was, of course, there, and if I have my little cheat sheet here, and my glasses also, some of the people that we had there is Ms. Mongolis from Seattle. She had organized a group out in Seattle. And, of course, we had Greta, Mr. Barrett from New York. He related that in his area there, Hurricane Sandy knocked out his neighborhood there in New York. And also his relatives in Honduras have suffered because of climate change there, the black and the brown. So this thing is all over the world. It is a worldwide situation. There is no doubt about that, period. And its impact on what is Generation X. They come into Generation Z. That is Greta Thunberg's generation. I'll eventually pronounce her name right. And all of this revolves around, in the U.S., the Green New Deal, which we endorse. The Green New Deal is a paper. It's not something that is etched in stone, but it is a plan, a number of policies that can be used to move the carbon footprint. And the carbon footprint will move one way or the other. If certain areas, particularly in the U.S., become not inhabitable, then the footprint will move. The people will move, period. And we had the recent floods around Houston, Texas there. 1,500 people, according to the mayor, were displaced. And there's a fund set up in Houston, Texas. And also, there is a number of claims. About 10,000 claims have been filed for automobile damage in the Houston area there. And this is really the start. This is September. Storm starts. As one person said in Houston, every year these storms come, and every year we have floods. We dry out the damage, and that takes a few days, weeks, and sometimes months to get in case we have to rebuild. and then it starts over again. So this has become a fact of life in many of these communities, yet we have fools that go around and say climate change. Well, Greta has answered that, and the people testifying before Congress has answered that, and there was one Republican type they put in there. We basically didn't include his testimony. He didn't have anything to say. And we had some senator talking about what capitalism was able to do, how he was able to get into some part of the recycle business. Well, so what? He was recycling. He made money off of, I believe, what was it? Trees that were cut down, that were taken to landfills. No doubt he was able to capture that and sell the pulp or whatever there. Anyway, there are, as Jesse would say, schemes out there, tricks in the system, as was the Depression, the Great Depression, that is, not the last Depression, but who actually is wanting a depression. So these are some of the things that you see out here floating around and floating around in the presidential race, floating around progressives, the so-called left. Some people there support the new Green New Deal. Some people do not. The Green New Deal is out there, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is doing an excellent job, and the other members of the squad. And so is Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. They have endorsed the Green New Deal. And where that moves, it moves along. With some recent polling here, we don't have it now. I think we talked about it on the Monday Morning Quarterback. We did. In Iowa, Liz Warren moved statistically tied with Joe Biden there, and Bernie is still there. But other polls come out will show Bernie ahead. So this is like Barack Obama said, one day you're up, one day you're down by a few points. That's more of a general election scenario, but that is what's happening now. And a number of people in Iowa, at least, are not decided. They could change their minds. So in other words, things move along. DJ Trump has caught himself in something that overlapped his general being of where he should and should not be with, of all places, Ukraine. And the new president, who is a comedian by profession, Zelensky, and his conversations with him, and he finally said yes, he did talk about him, and he was at the UN ranting and raving about Lunchbox Joe Biden and his corrupt family. Well, no doubt there was a lot of corruption in the Ukraine, and has been there. The story came out on that one, that actually what happened in Ukraine was the so-called prosecutor himself was corrupt, and they had to remove him. And there was no evidence that Hunter Biden did anything there. They moved, and Joe Biden was the point person. He was evidently instrumental, according to this story, in the removal of this prosecutor there. And this is the time that the U.S. was supporting the so-called newly installed government. That became a joke. That's why the comedian is there now. The people are tired of it. The people of Ukraine are tired of these stories of so-called corruption. Where that flies in this country, who knows? But in the House, I believe it was 7 or 8 Democrats. We'll have it in a further wrote an op-ed, and they had been in the military. And I'm assuming our friend Spanberg, her first name, but anyway, Representative Spanberg of Virginia, Spanberg. Had been in the intelligence community. She's one of those, and there are quite a few people that Democrats, the freshman types, that had been in the military and won these seats from Republicans. Anyway, they signed a letter and said this, in fact, this happened, what DJ Trump did, and it is evidently part of a whistleblower's complaint. We've not seen it as of yet. Trump said, well, maybe he'd give the transcript out of his conversation. It doesn't matter. When it appears in the news, over time it becomes a fact of the case. That's sort of like if something is printed against a person in a newspaper that is libel and at some point there is a defamation suit filed. People forget about it being not factual, and it becomes factual. And that's the problem. DJ Trump, the same problem he has with his climate deniers operation he's got going. So all of these things are coming about there. And at the same time, Nancy Pelosi, who is obviously no friend of the impeachment process, is convening her caucus to decide where they want to go on this. And we at this mic, as far as the impeachment process is concerned, that is something when you have the evidence. And also, you have to have the likelihood to prevail in the Senate. In other words, you can impeach in the House, and that's what happened to Wild Bill Clinton. They impeached Wild Bill, had a Senate trial, and he was effectively acquitted because the Democrats controlled the Senate. And he went on to win a re-election handily over Bob Dole of Kansas. So that is the downside, that DJ Trump could be impeached, go to the Senate, get acquitted, and he's back in the saddle again, and he could win re-election. So that is the story there, and it also could affect House and Senate races, how that could do. In other words, it could cause many, many problems. So you have to wait until the case is a very solid case, and enough people have to come together to prosecute that case. We'll go now to the Select Committee's hearing in the Congress. And I noted there also in the Congress there was, as far as if I recall, only one African American on that committee, Representative Meeks of New York, that talked about the struggles of people and related the story of a young man, now a senior, John Lewis. He was 16 when he started marching. So that means that Greta has a long ways to go. And the lady, Ms. Mongolis from Seattle, said within 20 years or whatever, she could be in the Congress in one of those seats, which the possibility it will be there. So in other words, as the song says, changes are coming. This is Boston Red on the 24th of September 2019 in the Jerry Pippin broadcast booth, as we usually are. Good day.
Climate change is certainly something that is so important, and the aggravating thing about it is that there are so many who still deny it. So I look forward to listening to what our young people are saying today, because the world is really their future, and we owe it to them to do what we can now to make sure that the world is saved. And climate change is certainly something that is happening, and if we don't do anything about it, it will certainly imperil future generations. And I'm just happy to welcome everybody to the Foreign Affairs Committee room. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the chairman. I'd just like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Our panel represents the next generation of leaders, and so naturally, we're speaking to the future. However, let us be clear. We are also speaking to the present. We're witnessing the effects of climate change daily, whether it's storms, forest fires, floods, and other disasters occurring with increasing intensity and frequency. Increased migration due to sea level rise, threats to food and water safety. This is the reality we're facing right now because of climate change. Regardless of where we live, we all see it when we go home. I see it every time I go home. My district is in southeastern Massachusetts and has one of the longest coastlines in the country and includes island communities. On Cape Cod, we're anticipating a sea level rise of 1 to 2 meters by 2100 and 3 to 12 meters in the next few hundred years. Erosion and storm damage costs families and businesses trying to live with more than they can afford as every storm approaches, and with each storm we're also worried about the cost to lives as well. Our historic fishing and lobster industries are threatened by increasing ocean acidification and rising ocean temperatures. Our state and local governments are under immense pressure to address not only sea level rise but air and quality issues And in spite of having some of the best scientists and researchers right in that area in UMass and Woods Hole, it's an incredible challenge. There have been efforts spanning generations now in my district to diversify our energy supply, offshore wind, solar power, that'll bring in new jobs. Yet there are still major gaps in access for our communities and a real struggle to overcome the political and bureaucratic obstacles that go with making necessary changes to how things are currently. There must be leadership in addressing climate change because we, and especially your generation, can't afford for things not to change. This is a global issue, and the biggest polluters are going to be needed to make big changes, to do their part. But we need to be honest with ourselves as leaders. So far, our generation has failed to adequately address our climate crisis. This failure isn't fatal, yet our failure to change will be. Change happens through leadership. We wouldn't be in this situation right now. Our witnesses would be safely and happily in school, pursuing their dreams and not protesting and pushing their government to act if everyone was doing their part. America knows how to lead in a crisis, and it's high time we pick ourselves up and get back to this fight to bring the rest of the world with us, because waiting for other countries to do the right thing is making a bad bet on our future. There's so much we could and should do right now in our country. We have bright minds to engineer solutions to the future. America has shaped revolutions in industry time and time again, and it's made our country better off every time. Now the stakes are so much higher, and in spite of all our resources and ingenuity, the one thing we don't have is time. The IPCC report warns us that without cuts in carbon emissions, the world could see an average sea level rise of 62 centimeters over the course of the lifetime of people born today. That's over 2 feet. And scientists are gravely concerned that sea level rise in the next 100 years could be even faster than in the hundreds of years that preceded it. I'd like to thank our witnesses, extraordinary young leaders fortified with scientific research, for being here. It's regrettable they have to be. The Paris Agreement should have been reached decades ago, and we should have been well on our way by now towards far more aggressive targets, giving communities and industries the time to adapt and giving you a much more hopeful outlook on the future. But here we are, and I hope your testimony today will galvanize us to act now before we are truly out of time. Ranking Member Adam Kinzinger for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate it. Given the high level of interest in this hearing,
we know and love, but it is not enough, not by a long shot. This year, under Speaker Pelosi's leadership, we passed our first major piece of climate legislation in 10 years. A bipartisan vote sent H.R. 9, Climate Action Now, to the Senate, where it awaits action. That bill takes a common-sense approach of keeping the United States in the Paris Climate Agreement. Because the U.S., we shouldn't back down, we shouldn't surrender, not in the face of the climate crisis. We need to take bold action now. 70% of young people in America say they worry about climate change. I don't blame them. They're doing more than paying attention in science class. This generation is the most well-informed and connected generation in history, and everything they're learning has driven them to a new level of engagement. And students are asking policymakers a very powerful question. What's the point of going to school to learn about the climate crisis when your elected officials aren't doing enough to act on it? The climate strike movement has united young people in all countries, all across the globe. They're cooperating to demand climate action, and they're asking us to cooperate with allies to cut carbon pollution and protect our communities. It's not lost on us that the United States is responsible for the biggest share of carbon pollution accumulated in the atmosphere to date. So we have a very serious responsibility to lead. But we're also the world's greatest engine of innovation, And we can do this. We have the solutions. Local communities and states have acted boldly, but a strong national climate action plan has been missing. We've heard from scientists in the Select Committee hearings, as we will hear from these young people here today, that we must do more and that we do not have time to waste. Our answer has to be more than a promise to do better. Our solutions must equal the challenge before us. And I'd bet that 10 or 20 years from now, young people marching and striking today will be serving in the Congress. And we need to take bold action now because we can't leave it up to them to clean up the mess that Congress has made. People say this next generation gives us hope, but that's not quite right, is it? This generation is giving us a job to do. The job is addressing the climate crisis. If we do our job, then we will be worthy of their hope, because that means we'll have started to create the future that they're fighting for. The Select Committee has a mandate to come up with an action plan for Congress, and we need your ideas. We want the ideas to come from all corners of this country and beyond. You can go to climatecrisis.house.gov/info request and tell us what your ideas are to solve the climate crisis. Not all good ideas emanate from Washington, D.C. I think you know that. But it's only through cooperation, through coming together in our democracy, that we can address the climate crisis. These young people are rising to the challenge, and we need to rise with them. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The Chair now recognizes the Ranking Member of the Select Committee, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you all for being here today. Most importantly, I want to thank you for engaging in your government. Most young folks choose to not do that till many years later. I have 3 kids, and we often talk about some of the impacts that we've seen from climate change and sea rise, my home state of Louisiana, where some of the sea rise impacts have
Thunberg is from Sweden. She's a climate activist who helped build the Fridays for Future movement, where she began going on strike from school outside the Swedish Parliament on Fridays. She has spoken on the climate crisis before the EU Parliament. Welcome. Ms. Jamie Margolin is from Seattle, Washington. She's co-founder of the co-executive and co-executive director of the 0 Hour, an international youth climate organization founded in the summer of 2017. She's also a plaintiff in Piper v. State of Washington. Mr. Vic Barrett is from White Plains, New York. He's a fellow with the Alliance for Climate Education and a plaintiff in Juliana versus United States. Welcome. Mr. Benji Backer is from Appleton, Wisconsin. He's the president of the American Conservation Coalition, a nonprofit organization to educate and engage conservatives on climate change. All of you are here. We welcome all of you. We appreciate your efforts. Please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. I'll now go to Ms. Thunberg for her statement.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I have not come to offer any prepared remarks at this hearing. I am instead attaching my testimony. It is the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the SR 1.5, which was released on October 8, 2018. I am submitting this report as my testimony because I don't want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to the scientists. And I want you to unite behind the science. And then I want you to take real action. Thank you.
Tack så mycket. Ms. Margolin.
My name is Jamie Margolin, and I'm a 17-year-old climate justice activist from Seattle, Washington. I'm missing a lot of school to be here. It's my senior year of high school. I have college application deadlines looming over me, and to be honest, I've barely even started because I'm too busy fighting to make sure that I'm actually going to have the future I'm applying to study for. You're here spending a few moments with me, but that is nothing compared to the hours that members of Congress have spent with lobbyists from corporations that make billions of dollars off of the destruction of my generation's future. I want the entirety of Congress, in fact, the whole U.S. government, to remember the fear and despair that my generation lives with every day, and I want you to hold on to it. How do I even begin to convey to you what it feels like to know that within my lifetime, the destruction that we have already seen from the climate crisis will only get worse? What adds insult to injury is the fact that we keep getting promised what isn't there. On college applications, I keep getting asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? The media, pop culture, businesses, and the whole world tells me that I and my whole generation will have something to look forward to that we just don't. You're promising me lies. Everyone who will walk up to me after this testimony saying that I have such a bright future ahead of me will be lying to my face. It doesn't matter how talented we are. It doesn't matter how much work we put in, how many dreams we have. The reality is, my generation has been committed to a planet that is collapsing. The fact that you are staring at a panel of young people testifying before you today, pleading for a livable earth, should not fill you with pride. It should fill you with shame. Youth climate activism should not have to exist. We are exhausted because we have tried everything. We've built organizations, organized marches, and worked on political campaigns. I sued my state government in a lawsuit called Piper versus the state of Washington, along with 12 other plaintiffs, for contributing to the climate crisis and denying my generation's constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property. The lawsuit is also arguing that the natural resources of my state are protected as a right under the Washington State Constitution. The shellfish, salmon, orcas, and all of the beautiful wildlife of my Pacific Northwest home is dying due to ocean acidification caused by the climate crisis, and communities all over Seattle are suffering from the new fossil fuel infrastructure being built to lock in decades more of climate destruction into my state. My friends and I were warned to stay inside the last 2 summers because our city was shrouded in a suffocating smoke from wildfires. It gave me such bad headaches for so long, and my friends with respiratory illnesses had to go to the ER. Is this the future that we have to look forward to? Well, we the youth are working as hard as we can to make sure that it isn't. On July 21st of 2018, after an entire year of nonstop organizing, despite being full-time high school students with a lot of homework to do, my organization, 0 Hour, marched on Washington, D.C. in a pouring rainstorm and in 25 cities around the world, demanding urgent climate action from you and all of our leaders. And that was only the beginning. But by 2030, we will know if we have created the political climate that will have allowed us to salvage life on Earth, or if we acted too late. By then, we must be well on the path to climate recovery, but this must start today. In fact, it should have started yesterday. By 2030, I will be old enough to run for Congress and be seated right where you guys are sitting right now. By then, we need to have already achieved net zero greenhouse gas emissions and be rapidly on the path to climate recovery. I can't wait until I'm sitting in your seats to change the climate crisis. You have to use the seats that you have now, because by the time I get there, it's going to be way too late. The good news is that experts agree that there are multiple pathways to decarbonize the United States energy system, and that doing so is both technologically and economically viable and beneficial. The most frustrating thing is that the U.S. government can't even begin to imagine the massive political shift that has to happen in order for us to solve this issue. The politics just hasn't been invented yet. Solving the climate crisis goes against everything that our country was unfortunately built on: colonialism, slavery, and natural resource extraction. This is why the youth are calling for a new era altogether. As Greta mentioned, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that we only have a few months left in order to create the massive political shift needed to transition our world to an entirely renewable energy economy. This needs to happen within the next 10 years, which is our deadline to save life as we know it. People call my generation Generation Z as if we are the last generation, but we are not. We are refusing to be the last letter in the alphabet. I am here before the whole country today, announcing that we are instead Generation GND, the generation of the Green New Deal. The only thing that will save us is a whole new era. The Green New Deal is not just about the specific plans laid out in resolutions, it's about a new chapter in American history and transforming our culture into one that celebrates, encourages, and enables radical climate action. It is right here, testifying before you, that I'm proud to announce that history is being made. You've heard of the Reagan era, the New Deal era. Well, the youth are bringing about the era of the Green New Deal.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
My name is Vic Barrett. I'm 20 years old, and I'm one of the 21 youth plaintiffs in the Juliana versus United States constitutional lawsuit, suing the executive branch of the federal government for knowingly causing climate change. I'd like to recognize my fellow co-plaintiffs in this room sitting behind me. I'm a first-generation Garifuna American. My people are an Afro-Indigenous community originally from the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean. In the 18th and 19th centuries, we were pushed from our homeland on St. Vincent by British colonial power, settling on the eastern coast of Central America in Honduras and Belize. Despite overwhelming adversity, we organized our community and emancipated ourselves to protect our future as a people. However, the struggle continues for me and my people. As temperatures increase, sea levels rise, storms become more intense and frequent, and the coral reefs and fisheries upon which we depend disappear, the oceanfront land that my family has inhabited for generations and that I'm supposed to inherit will be underwater if the U.S. federal government continues to promote a fossil fuel-based energy system. It is not just me and my people in Honduras being harmed by climate change. Frontline communities around the country and around the world are already feeling the effects of the climate crisis, from the dispossession of land to the grave public health threats that are disproportionately affecting myself and other young people. These frontline communities are made up of people who look like me: young, black, and brown, LGBTQ, indigenous, identities which place them at a significantly higher risk to experience the impacts of climate change than the general populace due to their marginalized status in our society. I myself have felt the consequences of climate change directly. Growing up in New York, I was impacted by the climate change-fueled Hurricane Sandy, which left my family and school without power for days. I still experience grave anxiety about experiencing another climate-driven disaster like Superstorm Sandy and the harm that these storms will have on myself and my family. As someone who already struggles with anxiety and struggles with depression from my understanding of climate change and what I experience, watching our government knowingly perpetuate the climate crisis is extremely overwhelming. I wrestle with this anxiety every day, from the moment that I wake up in the morning to the moment I fall asleep at night. If we keep going on with business as usual, both Honduras and New York, the places where my family and I are from, will forever be lost to the sea. That is one of my greatest fears, that climate change is going to take these places away from us. My co-plaintiffs also experience both the mental and physical health impacts of climate change. My co-plaintiffs with asthma and allergies have suffered from the prolonged wildfire and allergy seasons in the West, limiting their ability to participate in certain activities or even go outside. Many of them, like me, are also struggling with psychological harms from climate change. The medical community now recognizes climate change as a grave public health threat. One of our experts describes climate change as a public health emergency, which is disproportionately impacting children and youth in a myriad of ways. He lists specific health threats exacerbated by climate change, including heat stress, extreme weather events, wildfires, decreased air quality, and infectious disease, all of which pose a disproportionate threat to children and to youth. Another one of our experts, Dr. Lies van Susteren, a psychiatrist known nationally for her work on climate change, explains that, quote, with continued government actions that exacerbate the climate crisis, the plaintiffs and those they represent will suffer catastrophic emotional injuries. She goes on to state that the federal government's, quote, sanctioning of climate change as lawful in federal law and policy makes the psychological injuries suffered by individuals, including the plaintiffs, particularly harmful and insidious. She warns that without immediate action by the federal government to address climate change, the mental health impacts will worsen and be lifelong. Just as my federal government sanctioned discrimination in schools and housing until the middle of the last century, a policy that harmed children, my federal government has also orchestrated and sanctioned a system of fossil fuel energy that is harming children in another way, irreversibly threatening our health, our personal security, our homes, and our communities by recreating a dangerous climate system. Like youth who have come before us in the civil rights movement and other social justice movements, it is often the youth that must shine a light on systems of injustice. So in 2015, 21 young people, myself included, filed a lawsuit against the United States and agencies of the executive branch to safeguard our constitutional right to life, liberty, and property, including our rights to personal security, bodily integrity, and a stable climate system that sustains our lives and liberties. I was born into a world in which my future and my past are uncertain, born into a world where my culture and inheritance are literally slipping into the sea, born into a world where my people are going extinct. Show children everywhere that you care about our future and the future of all generations to come. Now is your time to stand in solidarity with me and my co-plaintiffs, America's youth, and communities around the world to fight for a just future free from catastrophic climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Beck. Right in as you see fit. Comment on what that's like. I think that message should be heard by all of us. Not just urgency, but what are we doing to the next generation? How are their lives impacted by what we're not doing and what we're doing? So if you could, I'll let you just choose among yourselves. Each of you will have a chance to answer that question.
For me, it's really been affecting because similar to Vic, I already have like underlying issues of like anxiety, and it's just really hard to grow up in a world full of ifs. You know, I don't think a lot of people in Congress understand the conversations that are happening in everyday American high schools, but we're constantly asked, prepare for your future, study for your future, do this for your future. But our world is full of ifs. I'll be talking to my best friend and she'll be like, yeah, you know, I really want to see this natural place sometime if it's going to still be around. I really want to study to be this if that's still going to be a possibility. And it's just like this constant looming uncertainty. And it's this weird form of nihilism and weird just fear that's been existing in my generation, where kids are joking like, what is even like the point? The world is ending. What are we studying for? What are we doing? And it's this kind of depression. It's this fear that is not just among me or my panelists here, but everyone. And that anxiety is something that no child should ever have to fear. Because if you think about it, if you go back to what is the purpose of a parent, down to just the biological purpose, it's to give their child the best future and the best life that they can possibly have. And the supposed American dream is to make sure that children have a better future than the adults. But right now, it's like some members of government and some corporations are actively pointing a gun to children's futures and actively making it worse, actively going out of their way to support corporations and poison us and destroy our future. And that is horrifying, and it feels like a betrayal. It's like a knife to the heart to know that people who have kids, they'll go around in these campaign ads and they'll be like holding these babies like, oh, you should vote for me. Look at me interacting with a small child, while they actively poison and choose their wallets over their children. So it's very devastating and scary, but it's also, it feels like we've been betrayed.
In less than a minute, would anyone else like to comment on that?
Young people are in the midst of their development. Adolescence isn't characterized as being easy without also dealing with the greatest existential threat of our time.
I definitely understand.
I would stop dumping my trash in the ocean and tell the other boat to stop dumping their trash in the ocean as well.
And that's the important point here. I think that what we need to be doing is we need to be focusing on the countries that are dumping trash in the ocean. Of course, that's a metaphor. The fact that China is, here we are talking about reducing emissions, yet China, under the Paris Accords, are going to be increasing their emissions by nearly 50%, 5 gigatons annually. So while in the United States we need to continue investing in innovative solutions and exporting clean energy technologies, it makes no sense for us to be doing it if we're simply watching for increases in China. Mr. Becker, the IPCC report talks about numerous solutions moving forward, including clean energy and others. Under IPCC, does it contemplate only renewable energy sources moving forward?
Thank you.
now.
Thank you very much.
I would also like to add, answering that question, I would like to acknowledge that we have some Amazon protectors in the room right now who are fighting to protect the Amazon rainforest, and that is a place in the world where people are gravely suffering, not exactly from climate change itself, but from the causes of the climate crisis. The animal agriculture industry is behind, and the collusion of the animal agriculture industry with the governments of Brazil and other countries that would rather make a short-term profit than protect the lungs of our planet. The Amazon rainforest is the lungs of our planet, and that's why we're seeing these massive fires, and it is indigenous protectors like the ones here sitting who have been fighting, literally putting their bodies on the line and suffering from these fires. And I don't want to speak for them because I don't know their own stories, but I encourage you to talk to them later. But I think it's also very important that as we speak from an American perspective, we also realize that the climate crisis is global, and that even though maybe for me personally, I have Latin American roots and that my family is from Colombia. But even if you don't have those roots in Latin America, the Amazon rainforest is the lungs of our planet. And so it burning down, we must unite with Latin America, and we must unite with the indigenous activists and listen to them and give them a platform, and also not perpetuate the same systems of oppression that have been pushing them down, because it is, and I don't want to speak for this, and I don't know if, Vic, you have anything to add, but it is the same systems of oppression that are causing the climate crisis that are making people feel the worst effects. To add to something that I heard earlier, I just want to say real quick, I realize my time is running out, but Albert Einstein defined insanity as trying to solve an issue with the same thinking that caused it. And right now, something that has been disturbing me a lot is seeing the way that we are trying to colonize and buy and sell our way out of a problem caused by colonization and buying and selling.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm over time. I yield back.
Goes away. It doesn't go away. It creates all kinds of bad things for the environment. The gases, one of the most feared gases is methane. It's when something decomposes in an anaerobic or in the absence of oxygen. So if we could compost those things, 85% of that waste stream could be turned back into soil, which would be utilized, I think, in a capitalist manner. And you wonder about capitalism. Well, I had the opportunity, I was sitting there with AOC, and I was pitching to her capitalism. I don't really know if it caught on with her or not, but my point was this. I said, you want to do away with airplanes. Well, airplane engines that put out gases that are harmful to the environment. And I said, MIT right now has an airplane engine that has no moving parts and allegedly puts nothing harmful into the environment. No moving parts. And to me, that's just Buck Rogers. But I got on YouTube and I watched the video, and I watched it. You all could probably understand it, but my 55-year-old brain just doesn't understand it. But it's fascinating to me. But granted, all it did was fly a glider about the length of a football field. Well, I got to thinking, this little cell phone right here, 20 years ago, according to my friends at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, was a $100 million computer. 20 years ago. Capitalism brought this. Now everybody basically has a television studio, can get to all the information in the world, can contact anybody in the world for about $100 a month. And it's a pretty good deal. And that was through capitalism. And I would encourage you all to explore that realm.
A few students that I have the honor of working with in New Mexico, and one of them responded. Her name is Marina Weber Stevens. She's one of the founding members of the Global Warming Express. Anyone that's interested can find them at theglobalwarmingexpress.org. And she asked a very important question, but one that I think you have an answer to, and it's this. What is the best way to get the younger generation, teens and students involved in advocacy to address the climate crisis? And I would add to that, adults. What can we be doing? How can we get more young people involved?
How we can get more young people involved, I think to just tell them the truth, tell them how it is, and because when I found out how it actually was, that made me furious, so I wanted to do something about it, and that is at least I've spoken to many, and I think that is the experience many others have. because as it is now, people in general don't seem to be very aware of the actual science and how severe this crisis actually is. So I just think we need to inform them and start treating this crisis like the existential emergency it is. Then I think people will understand and want to do something about it.
I think that's powerful. Tell them the truth. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Carter. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me begin by thanking all four of you for being here. I cannot tell you how much this builds up my confidence in the younger generation. And having you involved in this, it's extremely important that you be involved in the process. And I applaud you for being here, and I thank you.
An economic threat, that's true. A national security threat, that's true. And ultimately, and most importantly, an existential threat. It has battered our coast, set our forest ablaze. In my home state, Mr. Barrett's home state of New York, Superstorm Sandy destroyed the property and uprooted the lives of thousands of New Yorkers, including many living in my district. If left unabated, climate change will displace world populations. Islands, Mr. Barrett, you're correct, will be gone where people currently live. And it will continue to wreak havoc on our own, costing billions in damage. That's economics. If we're not prepared, there will be billions of dollars that will cause economic damage if we don't do something about climate change. It will also, climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of progress in development, in global health, and poverty reduction. So we've got to do something urgently. If the world that we leave behind, and we all hold this world in trust for the next generation. So I look at it, the world that I leave behind for my new baby granddaughter will look dramatically different if we do nothing today. Indeed, a drastic reduction in our carbon footprint will be one of, if not the most important, missions of our time. I also want to say, and I heard Ms. McGolan say this a number of times, I just want to let you know that anxiety research indeed shows that young people have high levels of anxiety. It isn't, though, just because of climate change. Everything from the economics to health disparities to student loans, etc. Of course, climate change is compounding that problem. But what you are doing by being here and leading does make a difference. And I just used the example of one of my colleagues who at 16 years old helped change and shape a nation. His name was John Lewis. He put his life on the line. He had a lot of anxiety if you talk to him. But by doing this with that anxiety and turning that anxiety into something that you are going to lead to change, it makes the world a better place for all of us. So I compliment you on how you are using your anxiety to make a difference in the world. That is something that is so important. And indeed, yes, all young folks. I'm old enough to remember the civil rights movement when it was led by students and high school students who said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And they changed things. So believe this, that each and every one of you, Mr. Backer, I've been listening to you. You are part of a change that's going to make us all better, to make this nation and this world better. One of the things we'll fight back and forth, but guess what? I still bet on America. We'll go through some of the bad times, because Lord knows I've seen bad times, and I've seen us come through it. So I want to say to each and every one of you, don't give up on America, because what America is all about is that if we stand up and fight, if we stand up for what we believe in, we will change things. It does make a difference. It is the reason why I can sit here, Mr. Barrett, because I've seen my father go through some terrible times as an African American, and then I saw Barack Obama become president of the United States. Not just for black folks, but for all folks. Keep up your work. You will make this place we call Earth not only exist, but thrive and be a better place. And I yield back.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your extraordinary testimony. It makes a difference. It will make a difference. And by the way, it's bipartisan and based on science. Thank you for being here. We also want to thank Representative Costa, who's been here too, as well. So you stayed later than you agreed to. I know how hard-pressed you are. So if I could just ask those in the audience and the press, allow the witnesses to go to the anteroom where we came in from, so that you can get to your next place more quickly. So please remain seated. Allow the witnesses to go to the anteroom so that they can